to Down the Garden Path. Thanks for joining me here today. Today, I wanted to talk about butterflies. As we head into the migration season for our migrating butterflies, monarchs are always the most commonly known, but they are not the only one that migrates. So we'll get to that. But I wanted to discuss how important it is for our gardens to have the nectar plants, the pollinator plants, the pollinators everybody talks about, as well as the host plants. And the host plants are where the butterflies will lay their eggs because they know that their caterpillars, when the caterpillars hatch, they can eat that plant to grow. And if we start with the monarch, the most common, everybody knows it's important to have milkweed, right? But the downside is milkweed can be aggressive in a home garden. And so I think people have kind of moved towards, either keeping a small patch of milkweed, or if they're lucky enough to live near, natural, like, a ravine or a conservation area that they know it's there naturally, that's a bonus. And then they can have pollinators in your garden that will attract those caterpillars to feed once they are adults on your pollinator plants, and help with the pollinating of the plants as well as feeding the butterflies. It's great if you're able to maintain a small patch of milkweed, common milkweed, but you can also consider swamp milkweed. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have a swampy area. They do prefer a bit more even moisture. So, it'd be good, actually, probably a good plant for, like, say, a rain garden or a wetter area in your garden. But they will grow otherwise as well. And they are not as potentially aggressive as common milkweed. And monarch butterflies will still lay their eggs on it, and it is still something that their caterpillars can eat. So that is good to know. Poke milkweed, which I actually have. I thought I bought common or swamp milkweed, but I have poke milkweed. And apparently it's not as popular, which I can tell you it's not as popular. But in a pinch, they will eat it. So it's also good if you have a shadier yard. Maybe you don't have a lot of full sun. And mine is actually in a shady spot, and it grows fine. Not super showy or anything, but yeah, so it's something worth trying. If that is what your conditions are, then you're at least attempting to provide food for those caterpillars, and a place for the monarchs to lay their eggs. On this topic, I do want to note this is where dog strangling vine is so bad for the caterpillars and the monarchs and the butterflies, because shockingly, dog strangling vine is in the milkweed family, and it does to them, unfortunately, look like milkweed. So you'll find that they will accidentally lay their eggs on dog strangling vine, but that's poisonous to their young, that's poisonous to the caterpillars. So that's why it's really important, especially this time of year, to really cut it back, put it in the garbage. Do not put it in the brown bags. It's really important to get, and if you're walking around neighborhoods, I know I've done it, I've talked about this before, gone and ripped it up, because it has a negative impact on how monarchs reproduce. So that's one of the many issues it has, but that is one of them. So back to poke milkweed. So if you do have a shadier yard and you want to add something just in case, then I think it's a good option to do, and something I have done in my yard, in a shady area of my yard. I have also added, this year I've been more successful at growing the butterfly weed milkweed, which I find I have tried in the past and it hasn't been as successful, but I have it in the front and in the back, and it's doing better. It's a smaller plant. They've not flowered, so I haven't had that much luck, but that is another option as well. It's a smaller plant and is not invasive. I read that it likes the soil a little bit sandier and a little bit drier, which I thought was my issue with growing it, but and I do not have dry, sandy soil. But this year it is growing in what was my kind of vegetable garden along the pool. and it's growing in the front yard. So, and I'm sorry, I did get blooms, small blooms earlier this year as well. So yes, so that those are host plants for the monarch. So plants that, yes, they flower and have pollen and pollinate, but they are the only plant that monarch butterflies will lay their eggs on because that's what the caterpillars need in order to grow. So that's why they're so important. This is starting to be, and you might be thinking, well, it's pretty late in the season. Why are we talking about butterflies? But this is migrating season. And so the later August, early September brood, if you want to call them, of caterpillars are the ones that are going to make the trek. They're the ones that are going to make the trek to Mexico. So we need to still support those butterflies later in the season. And I'm sure with climate change and our weather changing, those dates are certainly not written in stone. So that's something that I'm wanting to talk about them now, because not just in the spring when we're planting things, but now that they need food and our support as much as possible. And so having those plants in our gardens, as well as getting rid of dog strangling vine for the monarchs, is really, really important. But I do want to talk about a few other butterflies that are probably less well known, but just as important. And the swallowtail butterfly is also, it's shocking that it's an easy one to support because its host plant are herbs, parsley, fennel, and especially dill. I see that all the time. People are like, what happened to my dill? Like something ate it overnight or over the weekend. It's just gone. Yay, you have a swallowtail butterfly laying eggs on your dill. So that is something even now in August, end of the summer, we can support. I was at a garden center yesterday and they still are selling dill, and you can grow dill. You can start it from seed very easily. And yes, it kind of spreads and you'll see that, fine foliage, pop up in the garden, but it's super not aggressive. But you can certainly have it in your garden, and I'm sure many of you do if you have an herb or vegetable garden. But have you ever considered putting like pots of dill in your flower gardens? And that could be another way that you can support the pollinators and the swallowtail butterfly. So parsley is another good one. And I've seen people do like little gardens where they've almost got like parsley's great. It's a pretty plant. It stays very compact. It's very green. It's pretty drought tolerant, compared to some of the other herbs. It still needs water, but it can, it seems to be a little bit more lush. And you can make almost like a little hedge, or a little, line in your garden of parsley. So I think that's something to consider, that it is still a pretty plant and you could add it to your flower garden and not just keep it put in your vegetable garden or in containers. I love that all three of these also grow in pots. So for you and on balconies or in small yards where you don't have a lot of space, you can still support some butterflies by having, parsley and fennel and dill, especially dill, around your yard or your front steps for the swallowtail butterfly. They will lay their eggs and then the caterpillars will eat it all up. So you may miss out on adding it to your dips and stuff, but it's kind of a great way to support your butterflies. And I think it's really, that's a great thing for kids too, to see a pot, like a couple pots in the garden or near where they are in the patio, and have them, watch for butterflies or watch for caterpillars and watch for them to eat. Because the caterpillars, once they start going, they can get quite large and they are very noticeable. So I think it's a great way to introduce children to nature and the importance of pollinators and just nature and laying eggs and watching the caterpillars grow. So I do want to go back, talk about, I think most people know, if I jump back to the monarchs, we all know what to plant as far as a nectar plant. We know that echinacea, it's sturdy and it creates a really nice, see a lot of pictures of monarchs on echinacea because those flowers are so sturdy that they make a great landing place, and that the butterflies can get the nectar out of the plant very easily. So we all know to plant echinacea. Liatris is also a very popular one, including the native meadowsweet blazing star. That's also a really important one for the monarch butterfly. So those are a few. There are many, I mean, and I'm just highlighting a few, but so yes. And then with the swallowtail butterflies, like I said, their host plants are the herbs, parsley, fennel, and dill. But they also have nectar plants, things like bee balm, Joe pieweed. Monarchs will also feed from both of those as well, so that's something to consider. But I think it's a good way to have a diverse menu, so to speak, for your butterflies in your garden. A third type of butterfly that I wanted to talk about is the painted lady, or the American lady sometimes. Now, they also look similar to monarch. They have the same coloring, and but they have a little bit more brown on them. You can look up pictures, or I'll post some pictures here of the differences. But they also migrate, and because they also cannot survive our winters. And they're a little trickier to provide host plants for, in the sense that their host plants can be a little aggressive. And I would think, in my garden, I would consider them weeds. So thistle, Canada thistle, mallow, burdock. They do use sunflowers, though. So if you do plant some sunflowers, then that is a good way also to attract the painted lady. They are the most common. So as much as we give monarchs all the attention, it seems, the painted lady is actually the most common butterfly, and it lives on all the continents except for Antarctica. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. So again, it is orange and black, much like the monarch, but it just has a little bit different eye spots on it, as well as a different coloring on the underside. Which are very hard to describe in a podcast and video. So that's something that you can Google and take a look at. And their pollinator plants would be things also, other types of common pollinators that we know of, like asters, goldenrod, also echinacea, coneflowers. And they also can be attracted to some of the annuals, zinnia, cosmos, lantana. The monarchs also really like lantana as well. So that's an annual that you can purchase or start from seed in the spring to have in your yard for the monarchs and the painted ladies. Isn't that cool? So I think it's neat that we can have things in pots, especially with people having less and less space in newer gardens and smaller homes. You can have, a couple pots of lantana, which are pretty yellow and red, almost on the same flower. My mother-in-law's favorite. She loved and she planted lantana all the time. So I think I've got to start planting it again. And so it is a pretty plant, and even though it's an annual, it sometimes will reseed, but you're not guaranteed that it will reseed in the garden, and certainly not invasively. Where it kind of takes over. So no worry there. But, again, if you have a small space, or, that you don't want to have a big garden but you still want to support pollinators and support the butterflies, then having a few pots of dill, a few pots of lantana can really go a long way for those butterflies. And something else to keep in mind is that obviously the caterpillars are eating the plants. But they're not necessarily going to eat, they're only eating their host plants, and they're not going to really damage your other pollinating plants. So if you see damage to plants, it's not in your garden. It is not the butterflies. Keep in mind, if you are doing things like this to attract butterflies and attract pollinators to your garden, then you do need to kind of cut back or eliminate harsh chemicals. They will, the residue left on the leaves will kill the butterflies and the caterpillars, in addition to the bad bugs, which, I know like the most nuisance bug right now for everybody is the Japanese beetle. And there's no spray because of the hard shell, which I guess is a good thing, because I think then people go crazy spraying it, and then we would really have more extensive damage to our pollinators. So I think that is the most important thing, is to really think about what you're spraying. There's really not a lot of chemicals available to us in Ontario, so that's a good thing. And soap and water can do a lot. And just having a biodiverse garden can do a lot, because they will take, I feel like things take care of themselves, which is why another reason why I think it's important to have butterflies, or to plant for butterflies, because it's just another biodiverse thing that you're adding to your garden. And it really, to me, shows that you have a healthy garden. So you can have a lot of plants and nobody visits them, and no, nothing for the birds, that type of thing. So I think it's a really important measure when you see other insects and beneficial insects like butterflies in your garden. Obviously, they're also food for the birds. So, sad to see the birds eating the butterflies, but, it's a circle of life too. So the sign of having a diverse garden means that you will naturally attract birds. You don't just have to put out seed. If you have, good insects in your garden, then the birds will come as well. So I just wanted to, remind everybody that the season isn't over, and to start looking out for those butterflies, like the painted lady, the American lady, the swallowtail butterfly, as well as, of course, the monarch butterfly, as they start heading to Mexico. So I hope this helps. If you have any other questions, please let me know. And I will probably repost this again in the spring when everybody's filling up their gardens and their pollinator gardens for what they can do to attract butterflies. But now I think we need to, we really do still want to feed them and help them with their migration by providing plenty of food for them still in our garden. So thank you very much for joining me here on Down the Garden Path, and we'll see you next time.